What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lamby here for Working Weights LLC, your guide to strength, health, and all things nutrition. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, aka Dwayne Ulrich, aka
Ah,
Poppy Doral.
hey.
Out of the gate today. All right.
Yeah.
And today we are continuing our series on learning to not repeat what you hear on the internet. We are covering logical fallacies.
Yes.
All right. Well, Dwayne, I botched that one.
It's okay. It's okay, brother. It's okay.
We'll recover.
I have some tension. I have some anxiety right now because I crashed and burned so bad last week. I don't know. I just had trouble grasping the arguments.
Oh yeah, between deductive and inductive.
Oh yes. I got off of there and later told my wife, I'm like, she goes, how'd the podcast go? I'm like, I sucked. However,
yeah.
I am the everyday man ombudsman, so there you go.
Yeah. It just takes a little practice deciphering which one is which. Like, is it really, really super important? Not really, but it takes a little bit of practice, but you're aware of it now. You know what I mean? Whereas you may not have been before. And that's kind of the main thing.
Right.
So
I've always been pretty good at picking up issues within an argument. I don't know, just kind of naturally, but I have difficulty planting that inside of one of our models here. So I'm like, wait a minute. So this last week, since the last podcast, my wife and I have had several discussions. I mean, and sometimes I've just taken the opposite tack, just not to make her mad or anything, but just to do it and see what happens. And so I found myself trying to go, okay, am I deductive right now or am I abductive? So anyway.
Yeah, it's I think I said it at the first episode when we were doing prop logic, because like once you're introduced to this and you kind of can start rolling with the thing, you'll never have a conversation in the same way again.
Right. Agreed. That mind map sure is getting big.
It's getting big. All right.
Holy
So what have we covered
moly.
so far? We covered propositional logic. We talked about what propositions are, what premises are, what an argument is,
Make
whether
that a
it's
little bigger,
valid or
coach.
sound.
Coach, make that a little bigger for me. There you go. Valid or sound.
Zoom, zoom. Yeah. So propositions, what they are not. We have our symbols and operators. We have our arguments, when an argument is valid and when an argument is sound. And then we went over some examples. Last week, we went over logical inference. We talked about deductive and inductive and where are you? Abductive inference. Talked about the difference between all of those. So we can do a refresher here. So deductive is top down. So deductive is when the conclusion is specific. Inductive is when the conclusion is general, right? And then abductive is kind of where you're eliminating all the possible explanations until you get down to what's left is the most probable explanation. So last week we ended on kind of introducing logical fallacies. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And logical fallacies is probably one of the most prominent things that you're going to see online in people's arguments. And so we have two types of logical fallacies, formal and informal. All right. And formal fallacies, we can think of this, a formal logical fallacy is a problem with the structure of the argument itself. Okay, so a formal fallacy makes an argument not valid, and validity means that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. All right, all formal fallacies are a form of non sequitur, and non sequitur just means it just doesn't follow. The conclusion doesn't follow. All right. Does that seem clear? A formal fallacy deals with the validity of the argument. and validity being that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. All right, so we have, and of course, for both formal and informal, these are not exhaustive lists. There are whole bunches of logical fallacies, but I just put the ones that I think are probably the most commonly used here. So number one, we have affirming the consequent. So in our formal argument here, P implies Q. If P, then Q. All right, so the first one will be the antecedent. And the first proposition, the second proposition is the consequent. Okay. Affirming the consequent means that you are assuming that because the second thing, the consequent, is true, then the first thing must be true as well. All right. So if we go back to our raining syllogism, if it is raining, the ground will be wet. The ground is wet, therefore it must be raining. Right? So we affirm that the second thing is true. We walk outside, the ground is indeed wet. That is true. So you assume that the first thing is true. Well, if the ground is wet, then it must be raining. And the problem with this is that there could be other reasons why the ground is wet, right? The sprinklers could have come on. Somebody could have came out there and opened up a fire hydrant, right? There are a lot of explanations.
Right.
Second one, denying the antecedent. So the antecedent being the first proposition, and the consequent being the second. And this is when you assume that because the first thing is false, then the second thing must be false, right? So if it is raining, the ground will be wet. It is not raining, therefore the ground will not be wet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Follows?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And
yes.
so
However,
go ahead.
However, okay, so denying the antecedent. So the antecedent is the P, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then denying the antecedent says that therefore the ground will not be wet. So the argument then is that there are other reasons that the ground can be wet, right? So
Yes, just because
are we denying P or are we denying Q?
we're denying P, right? So if it is raining, the ground will not be wet. It is not the case that it is raining. So P is false.
Okay.
So because P is false, you would assume that Q is also false. So if it is not raining, then the ground will not be wet. However, the ground could be wet. Just because it's not raining doesn't mean the ground doesn't get wet, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So P could be false. Q could be true. It could not be raining and the ground could be wet because there are other reasons why the ground could be wet. That makes sense?
Yes.
All right, moving on. Faulty syllogism. And now for all of these that I've listed, I just have P implies Q, and it could be many other things, but this is very simple. It's easy. And so we can get through this, right? So faulty syllogism. So a syllogism is a type of deductive argument, and that's what this is. If it is raining, then the ground will be wet. And it has two premises and a conclusion. P and Q are our premises. The conclusion, therefore, the ground is wet. All right, the faulty syllogism occurs when the structure of the syllogism is flawed and the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So example, all birds can fly. Penguins are birds. Therefore, penguins can fly. Well, we know it's not, we know it's the case that penguins and ostriches can't fly. Right?
Yes.
So that's a faulty syllogism. We have an appeal to probability. All right. And this is, you're just taking something for granted because it's probably the case. So example would be, I never lock my car and it's never been stolen. I've never had stuff inside of it stolen. Therefore, it's perfectly safe to leave my car unlocked. Or you could say it's perfectly safe to leave your car unlocked because I don't lock my car and nothing's happened. Therefore, it's perfectly safe. So this highlights the possibility that because the car hasn't been stolen in the past, that it won't be stolen in the future. But it ignores the likelihood that the cars or items within the car will be stolen. It's a little confusing, but
No, that's easy. That one's easier for me than the
Yeah,
second one
it's
was.
it's
So,
it's easy to, yeah, when you hear an argument like that, it's easy for you to go, no, I don't think that's really true.
right.
All right, base rate fallacy. This one is very, very common. So this happens when we tend to ignore general background information, or our base rate, and place too much emphasis on specific details when making probability judgments. So a big one that happens online in the diet sphere is this uh uh there was a study done, or a questionnaire or something, and
Yes.
85% of vegans return to eating meat at some point in their life. And a lot of people on the carnivore side like to tout this. All right. So this is a base rate fallacy because it ignores the percent of people who stop diets in general, right? So 85%
Right.
of people who go on a vegan diet return to eating meat at some point. And that sounds really, really bad. But then you go, well, compared to what, like how often do people fail diets in general? And so you'll hear another thing is that 95% of people will stop, or quote unquote they'll fail their diet within 3 years. 95% of diets fail. So if we think about it in terms of the base rate, you actually have a 10% increased chance of succeeding if your diet is plant-based, right? So it's a
Okay.
fallacy to think that if we were only to look at this 85% of vegans return to eating meat at some point, it would be a fallacy to think that is makes the a plant-based diet worse than any other diet, right? Because that number, that high 85%, seems to be such a high number. All right, so that pretty much takes care of our formal fallacies. And remember, formal fallacies deal with the validity of the argument. It makes an argument not valid. The conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. Now we're going to get into the informal fallacies, and these are much more common than the formal fallacies. As we go back to our examples that we looked over the past couple weeks here, most of these were valid, right? As we put them
Yes.
into our little calculator, and we formalized the argument, most of these were valid. So there weren't a lot of formal logical fallacies entailed there. But informal fallacies deal with the soundness of an argument. Okay. So this is an error in reasoning that arises from the content or phrasing of an argument that makes it unsound. And soundness in an argument means that the argument is both valid and all of the premises are true. Informal fallacies often appear convincing on the surface because they appeal to emotions, they use persuasive language, or they exploit biases in our thinking. Now, again, this is not an exhaustive list. This just happens to be the one that I think seems the most. Okay, so since we use the word emotion here, we're going to jump right to an appeal to emotion. And this is when you're trying to win an argument by manipulating the audience's feelings rather than using reasoning and evidence. And a good example of this is pretty much any weight loss program that you see online where they use before and after pictures, and they'll have captionings that say something like, are you struggling to lose weight? Do you feel frustrated and unattractive? Achieve your dream body with our miracle program, right? That's
Already appealing to emotion.
that's appealing to your emotions
Yep.
rather than using reasoning or evidence. Appeal from anecdote, super, super, super common. Anecdotal evidence. So this is like people's personal experiences, right? I got sick and I put onions on my feet, and I got better really, really quickly. That's an anecdotal evidence. So when that's presented as an argument without any other evidence or reason. Okay. And so Facebook groups are full of people who found success on a program or a diet or whatever the case may be, right? And a lot of people will use that argument for their program or their diet. Well, we have tons, thousands and thousands of people finding success in our Facebook groups. It's just anecdotal. And I like to, so when this argument comes up a lot and somebody will say, well, if thousands of people are reporting the same thing, wouldn't you be interested in about it? And I like to say, well, not really, because if thousands of people started reporting that the moon was made of green cheese, it wouldn't make me question what we know
Right.
about the moon, right?
Right.
Just because thousands of people are saying it doesn't sway my
Right.
yeah,
Right.
my confidence in it. All right, we have the appeal to nature or tradition. I think that this is probably number one in the diet, fitness, wellness blogosphere. Now, I've included nature and tradition together because you'll often see them put together. They are two separate fallacies, but you'll often see them used together. So this is the argument that something is either good or bad simply because it is either natural or unnatural, or more natural or less natural, or because we've done something for a certain period of time, right? So food X is better than food Y because food X is all natural. That doesn't tell me what the health outcomes are of food X and food Y. It could very well be the case that food Y provides better health outcomes, even though it's not all natural. Right?
Right.
Chemicals, though. So I've added a couple more examples up here. So let's scroll up here. I don't know if I can get in here, right? So we have a comparison between two products. We have a white box on the left and a
Can't
yellow
see it.
box on the right.
Make it bigger. Thank you.
Okay, so white box on the left, yellow box on the right, and we can see ingredients here. It's pasteurized cream and salt, and then the ingredients on the box on the right. And then, this person is posting the question, which one has more quote unquote chemicals? Right. So this is the argument is saying that the food in the white box is going to be better because it has less ingredients, making it more quote unquote natural.
Natural.
Right. And then the same thing here, right? But almost all vegetable oils aren't from nature, which is dumb, right? Because it's
Yeah.
a,
It's a vegetable oil.
yeah.
Wow.
So much processing is done, makes them unrecognizable to our bodies. So you can see that there's a big, long, like explanation here where somebody has tried to put together a whole bunch of evidence. And basically what it amounts to is an appeal to nature,
Yeah.
right? Vegetable oils are bad because they aren't natural, whatever that means for this person. All right. So chemicals, so anything dealing with chemicals is an appeal to nature, basically. There's also a fallacy called the fallacy of composition, but doesn't happen as much. All right, so coming here, sorry, family and friends. If God made it, this is an appeal to nature. God made volcanoes. I don't think anyone would argue that volcanoes are good for your health, right?
Yes.
All right. And then kind of getting into the appeal to tradition. So you might hear something like humans have eaten X for the last 300,000 years. Just because we did something for 300,000 years doesn't mean it was right or that it was the best thing for whatever outcome we're looking for, right? Genghis Khan conquered most of Asia, and the Mongol horde, ate only animal-based foods while they did this.
Every one of
Right?
those we could argue because it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, okay, maybe most of those are ridiculous.
We have hasty generalization.
Hmm.
This is where a conclusion is drawn based on an insufficient sample size or underrepresentative evidence. So examples of this are people who've tried fasting have lost a bunch of weight. Okay, that's a hasty generalization because you're only looking at a few people, right? And then that sample is actually extremely biased to survivorship bias. So the people who didn't lose any weight probably aren't going to report their outcomes in these Facebook groups and stuff where people are getting all
Right.
these anecdotes, right? They're
Right.
probably just gonna just not report anything, fall off and try something else. All right. Juice cleanses must be really healthy since they detox your body. Well, number
Yeah.
one, exactly what toxins are we talking about here? All right.
What
Number
juices?
two, what juices? Yeah. What quantities? So that's a big one too, quantity of something. Um, the what is it? the first rule of toxicology, the dosage makes the poison.
Yes.
Could be bad for your health, depends on how much of what juice you're taking. All right, so that's a hasty generalization. Okay, so just thinking that something is true based on a very, very small, unrepresentative sample size or evidence. Cherry picking. This is selectively presenting information that supports a particular position while ignoring significant portions of related information that may contradict it. So examples of this: recent studies show saturated fat has no impact on heart disease. And this is cherry picking because you're only picking a select few number of studies that support that position while ignoring the vast amount of evidence that's contrary, right?
Mm.
So you're only selecting that. Vegan diets can lower cholesterol. So you're only selectively picking examples where vegan diet lowers cholesterol and ignoring all the examples of an omnivorous or an animal-based diet where people have lowered their cholesterol as well. Appeal from ignorance. So this is the thinking that something must be true or false simply because it hasn't been proven true or false. So a very popular one that we see online is people will say, well, I'm not convinced the LDL cholesterol is an issue on a low carb diet because it's never been studied in the context of a low carb diet. Right? And
Yeah.
so my response to that always is, well, I'm not really sure hyperglycemia or elevated triglycerides is a problem in the context of a Coca-Cola only diet because we've never studied those things in the context of a Coca-Cola only diet. Right? When you put it that way, it sounds
Yeah.
stupid.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
All right. Appeal from incredulity. So a proposition must be false because it contradicts one's personal expectations, beliefs, or seems difficult to imagine. Now, we do this as a people on a regular basis. So I have a couple here. So how could a food humans have been eating for thousands of years be responsible for modern diseases? We've heard that one before, right?
Yes. Yes.
Just because you don't believe it or just because you don't understand how it could possibly be true doesn't mean it's not. I can't see how lab-grown meat could possibly be good for you. These are appeals from incredulity. Now, people do this all the time, like you're watching the news or you're reading the paper or you hear a story and something happens and you go, I just can't imagine how that could happen. Right? That's an appeal from incredulity. Just because you can't imagine it doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it's not possible. All right, a straw man. Now I have the straw man and the Mote and Bailey here. We've seen the Mote and Bailey a couple of times. And these two are kind of interrelated. Mote and Bailey isn't exactly a fallacy, but it's kind of the inverse of a straw man. So a straw man is when you misrepresent someone else's position to make it easier to defeat. And the Mote and Bailey is when you misrepresent your own position to make it easier to defend. So a straw man is where somebody says something like the dietary guidelines encourage people to eat pizza and sugary breakfast cereals, right? Well, the dietary guidelines have never recommended Tostino's pizza and Lucky Charms. That's never been in there. So that's a straw man to make the argument for the dietary guidelines easier to defeat. Now, the Mote and Bailey is when you present the extreme position first, and then when you're challenged, you repeat to a more moderate position. And I'm going to show the example of that we've been using over the last few weeks. All right. And then we have equivocation. Now, this is when we call two different things by the same name, or we're using multiple definitions for the same thing. And a lot of people will do this as you have a conversation. The definition for what they're talking about changes, right? So something you might hear is you ask for someone to help, and they'll say, well, I'll help you work on the project. And then later on, when it's time to help, and they'll say something like, well, I didn't say how much I would help. All right, so going up to our examples that we've been using over the last few weeks here. All right, so hunger is the first element of discipline. If you can control what you eat and drink, you can control everything else. So the first sentence would be our conclusion. If you can control what you eat and drink, you can control everything else. So this would be an example. This is an example of affirming the consequent. So if you can control everything else, then you are presuming then you can control what you eat and drink.
This is hard. It's not so hard to make the argument, I think, in my own mind, but it's finding the category it's in. That's
Yeah,
tough.
so finding specifically what it is starts to become a little tough. And it, like I say, it just takes practice of where you look this up. And this is where Chat GPT becomes very or Google Gemini becomes very helpful. But now you have the ability to read that. It's clicked on in your mind like, that doesn't necessarily make sense.
Exactly.
So in the way that we formalize this statement being that this is P, therefore Q, or then Q, therefore hunger is the first element. If you were to deny, so if we said not P, so if it was not the case you could control what you eat and drink, then it would be not Q, which is false, right?
Right.
You could control other things just because you couldn't control what you eat and drink.
Right.
If you're not vegan, have you considered that animals in sanctuaries are being rescued from you? Now, this one I think is a little bit of a straw man. Right? Because
Really.
we talked about um so this is generalized animals. And it's hard to say specifically which ones are being now. Is it the case that an animal who's rescued in Saskatchewan, Canada, is being rescued from me? No. So this one I think is a little bit of a straw man.
So you don't think that would be hasty generalizations?
It could also be hasty generalization. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. This one here, I definitely think is a hasty generalization. If you take the vitamin D, you need to take the magnesium. Right.
Mhm.
So saying that magnesium activates vitamin D, well, there could be different pathways of activation for vitamin D, right? Vitamin K2
Yes.
keeps calcium out of arteries and bones. Well, there are different forms of K2, and specifically MK4 doesn't really get absorbed in your body, so it's not going to do very much for you. So this is a little bit of a hasty generalization.
Yeah.
All right. Obesity was uncommon before the 1970s. Then our diets changed. Now obesity and diabetes rates are higher at any time in recorded history. What do you think about this one?
Go back in on it a little bit. Oh,
Yeah,
okay. It went away.
what are you looking for?
Well, I was just
Those can come.
I don't agree with his first statement. I think his first statement has no basis. Um, so
Okay.
I mean I just that first statement. Well, really? He just postulates that? It's like, oh, obesity was uncommon before the 1970s. Really? Was it? Then our diets changed to cut out healthy fats and replace them with seed oils, refined carbohydrates. Now, obesity and diabetes rates are higher than any time in recorded history. It has to do with generalizations, but
So you think this would be affirming the
uh,
consequent? So because the second premise is true,
no,
that the first
no,
one has to be true?
it doesn't. It doesn't.
Do you think he's assuming that?
I think he's assuming it.
Okay. So
I think
this would be an example of affirming the consequent.
yes,
Yes. So the logic he used to get to here is by affirming the consequent.
right.
Yeah. This one here, here's a common patient that ends up on my operating table. Male in his 60s, diabetic, on a statin, LDL managed per the guidelines, diabetes, insulin resistance not adequately addressed. He's been told to eat a low-fat diet. The system failed him. What do you think about this one? For me, this is an anecdote. This is an appeal to anecdote. This is also a straw man.
I think it's a straw man.
Mm-hmm.
There's one
Yeah.
other thing that there was. Let me hang on a second. Let me look at one
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. So this is a
Um,
good example. So we've had a couple here. You can actually have more than one fallacy within an argument.
I don't know. This is reaching. This is reaching, but I also think that it's possibly. I think it's also a possibly appeal to emotion
Yeah.
that
Could be. Yep.
because just his conversation, just saying that is like
This sentence right here, the system failed him.
failed him.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's an emotional
That's meant to
statement.
play on emotion. Yep, definitely. All right. So let's go down to my convo with Alice Clearman here.
Oh, this is just wrong.
This is
I
just
can't
wrong.
I
I'm a
can't tell you how many people I've
neuropsychologist.
talked to about this.
The brain does not need dietary carbohydrates for fuel. All right. So this whole thing here, all right, the reason that I had confidence in challenging this person who is a PhD in neuropsychology was number one, formalizing the argument in my head. It didn't hold true, right? I didn't find this argument to be valid. Okay. Then using logical inference to say, well, okay, if it is the case that the brain does not need dietary carbohydrate for fuel, then it would be the case that the brain would never require dietary carbohydrate for fuel at any point during a person's life,
Right.
right? Which I know
Correct.
is false.
Yeah.
Okay.
That right.
Yes. I was thinking about this. There is a logical fallacy in here.
Mhm.
Um, so let me see. Let me go back down. Look at these. So even I have to look at these lists sometimes. So there's an appeal to an emotion in here. And then there's also the hasty generalization,
Yeah.
right? So there's the hasty generalization that because we have some evidence of dietary ketosis affecting as a benefit to the brain. Now we don't know what benefits she's talking about. Okay.
Right.
Just a general benefit. And then our bodies can generate plenty of glucose when we're in ketosis. To come to this conclusion here, then, would be a hasty generalization.
Right.
All
Right.
right.
Before you say, wait, can I stop
Go
you for
ahead.
a second?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Going back to that real quick. Just slide back over to the deal there. There you go. Whoa, there you go. So there's something wrong with this statement. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but just this statement, there's something wrong. In fact, dietary ketosis is showing strong evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the fact? I mean, in fact, people might be doing this.
So this is good because next week we're going to talk about how to read a paper. So you're
Okay.
questioning, is it a fact that dietary ketosis is showing strong evidence to the brain? And in that case, in order to establish whether or not that's true, we have to go read some papers,
Yes.
right?
Citation. That's your answer.
Yes.
Citation
So
then.
we're gonna learn that next week. Okay. So I asked for the citation, and basically the reason that I'm asking for that is because of my logical inference here. The brain does not need dietary carbohydrate for fuel. If it is the case that the brain does not need dietary carbohydrate, then at no point in a person's life will the brain need dietary carbohydrate for fuel. So
Right.
evidence
Yes.
to support this.
Yeah,
All right.
exactly.
And then what she sent me, where
This is
if
the
you were to
best
click
part.
on that, all right, it would just be a general search result for ketogenic diets. I'm sorry
Mhm.
about that. All right. And I said, okay, okay, let me rephrase this. what is the evidence that a person could spend their entire life, because we can infer that from her statement, right?
Mhm.
Without dietary carbohydrates and not experience any adverse brain consequences. A ketogenic diet does not necessarily mean zero dietary carbohydrates. Now, my sentence here, a ketogenic diet does not necessarily mean zero dietary carbohydrates, highlights the equivocation that she had between the brain does not need dietary carbohydrates and a ketogenic diet. Okay. So what she's meaning here is that we have this evidence of ketogenic diets, which are low in carbohydrates. You can get very low in carbohydrates, but they're not zero dietary carbohydrates.
Mhm.
And so she has two different definitions for the same thing.
Mhm. Yes.
I can't remember what was set up here. I think this was the part where she said she doesn't make unsubstantiated claims,
Yes.
right? So I
Yes.
said,
Yes.
well, then
And she doesn't argue.
substantiate it. Yes, substantiate it, right? The only evidence you've provided is a diet that contains carbohydrates. So please provide evidence of a person going their whole life without dietary carbohydrates, or just concede that you can't substantiate the claim, right?
Mhm.
And then she says, I don't argue. I'm not going to now. And then again, I reiterated, if you know of a trial of zero carbohydrates within the scientific literature, I'd like to see it. If not, right, you're making
Mhm.
unsubstantiated claims on the internet. And oh, here we go. This is what it was. So this one is above this one. And basically, what this uh, uh, devolved into was her own personal experience, right? We're in the early days of learning about this. Okay, so if we're in the early days of learning about this, then we can't possibly know that it is the fact, right?
Right.
Okay, so she has a contradiction within her own line of arguing. I
Right.
follow the evidence, and the beauty of science is that it is ever changing and self-correcting. I didn't include this in here, but that's called a red herring.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with the conversation up to this point. All right. And a red herring is just like something off in left field that doesn't
It's distraction.
yeah, it's a distraction. Doesn't interact with the proposition. I feel so much better limiting my carbs to no more than 20 grams a day. For me, quality of life matters. May not work that way for someone else. Okay, so what has happened here is that this bold claim, when sufficiently challenged,
Fails to this.
comes down to an appeal to anecdote. So I feel better on my limiting my carbs to 20, right?
Yeah.
And for me, quality of life matters. May not work that way for someone else. So we had a very bold claim. So number one, we have the appeal to anecdote. We
Yeah.
have a very bold claim that when sufficiently challenged is reduced to a more moderate claim, right? So
Right.
this claim obviously very hard to defend as we go through the conversation here, and then it comes down to a more moderate thing, which I can't right? I can't
Right.
argue with the fact, right, that she may feel better and that for her quality of life matters and
Right.
that it may not work that way for someone else. Can't argue with that. So this is a Moat and Bailey.
Go back to her original statement.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I'm a neuropsychologist. Okay, I have a problem with that to start with. Um,
That's an appeal to authority.
it is because, okay, psychologists don't typically they're not particularly versed in scientific, in chemical and, the breakdowns as maybe a researcher would or a scientist. So already she's already on shaky ground with me, but she goes, the brain does not need dietary carbohydrates for fuel. Okay. Therefore, our bodies, blah, blah, blah. Go back to her deal over there where it says, I feel so much better when I limit my carbohydrate intake to 20 milligrams a day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, okay, she's not talking specifically about what her brain needs,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're just by saying that, there's an inference to me that the brain doesn't need carbohydrates to build for fuel. Okay, well, cool. So she's inferring that she doesn't need carbohydrates to me. But I mean, I know that's a generalization for my part, but for her to say, I limit my carbs to 20 grams a day and feel great.
Mm-hmm.
Really? And then for me, quality of life matters. Okay. And that's from nowhere. Anyway, yeah, Moat and Bailey.
Moat and Bailey. There's another
Yeah.
one you just brought up, but let me see. There are a whole bunch of just a whole bunch of fallacies that can fall from a short conversation with someone. So genetic fallacy, this is another one. I didn't include this, but the crux of this is that is to conclude that a position is true or false merely in virtue of the one uttering the position.
Hmm.
So this is false. I'm a neuropsychologist. Genetic fallacy,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
Because uh, so what?
Yeah.
So what if you're no such?
Yeah.
Why does that
Exactly.
lend? Yep. So
Exactly.
we're yeah. So she's expecting you just to believe what she says on the basis of her credentials.
Right.
So you were talking about how she's a neuropsychologist, and that doesn't necessarily mean that she knows a lot about nutrition science and blah blah blah. Dwayne, would you say that going through this conversation that I had with her, that maybe she's just repeating what she heard on the internet and she doesn't actually know anything?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Which
Absolutely.
would
Because
kind of be the point of our whole series here, huh?
right, she's coming from a point, a spot of like making these huge, this huge statement, blah, blah, blah. But then once we've worked it down, and I think there's some emotion involved in it for her because nobody really likes to be called out by someone who, is poking just, well, like, well, give me specifics, and they can't. And so then they start backing off to a more generalized. So she comes out with this great statement in the beginning,
Hmm.
but at the end, it's like, I'm about quality of life. And hey, 20 milligrams a day makes me feel great.
Yes,
So,
I'm going to tell you here.
and she just sent you to the front page of PubMed.
Right,
Sorry, Alice, love you, but in Jesus, but no.
right. So right here in this post, and then where she sent me in PubMed, which was just a general search,
Right.
and all of this nonsense here. So this one here is she's just repeating posts that she's seen other people make.
Right.
She hasn't looked into this. She's just repeating stuff because going back to our fallacies, our informal fallacies often appear convincing on the surface because they appeal to emotions, they use persuasive language, or exploit biases in our thinking, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So she obviously has some bias towards a ketogenic diet. I'm glad that it has helped her,
Yep.
right?
Me too.
Hopefully she's on the track on the fast track to better health.
Yep.
But
Me too.
yes, but right, she clearly hasn't done any research in this realm because when you press her for it, it just divulges into her personal experience.
Can I just say also, uh, there's no reason to go off into why I can say this, but if somebody wants to know, let Coach Lamby know and I can explain it to you. But not everyone that has a doctorate is the sharpest pencil in the box. So just because she puts that out there, in the attempt of like, okay, trying to show authority, I understand it, understand what she did, but I'm sorry, it doesn't mean that everything she's going to say is factual and provable and sound or even valid.
Yeah. So yeah, and the whole point of this series that we're doing is to help people identify the errors in reasoning that you're going to see online. And apparently I need to adjust my focus here. Hold on.
That looks okay to me. But
I'm not blurry?
no. It's your eyes. You're clear to me.
Oh,
So
really?
here's another thing that
Wild.
we haven't really talked about, and that is by doing these studies and by studying this, and some of you might be listening, and some of you may have just bailed out because, oh my God, what are you talking about? But we get to this point, if you've listened this long, not only does this help us to look at other people's arguments or other people's comments, say online, on social medias and so forth, but also just thinking in these terms. I'm not saying you have to like bank on it or sleep on it or these notes under your pillow, but I have found that this even changes the way I present information or go into a
Hmm.
conversation with other people because this is what I would expect. So if I just came in and said, man, the sky is so blue today, it's going to be a bad day. Well, that's just stupid. Okay. But you see, so the sky is so blue today. The weather front that just came down through this area cleared out a lot of the haze and pushed out a lot of the clouds. The temperatures came down. It's a clear blue sky. And you go into the weather, you got to explain it. So just be more careful in how you present information. Man, I just had a coffee. It's going to be a beautiful day.
Yeah.
Really? That,
And this,
that's,
if you practice these things and you continue to learn more on your own, even if you just take what I've shown in the last few weeks, which is really just the basic stuff,
yeah,
and you just practice that and get pretty good at it, you're going to find that your positions on certain things are going to be stronger because you're going to start to see flaws in your own reasoning, or you're going to start to see that your arguments for something is just you repeating arguments that you heard before.
mhm,
And so now it might be in your mind like, let me break this down, actually formalize it. Let me see what's in here. And that might, require you to go on and learn more about this thing. And that's the whole point of this is, right? Just stop just repeating what you hear about
right,
it and
right,
actually learn something. Don't just take someone's word for it and say, well, because this person said it, or I saw it on this blog post, or whatever the case may be, and it sounds convincing. It seems like it makes sense, right? And then you go and repeat that. It doesn't actually mean that you know anything about that.
right, right. And
So,
sometimes, I'm sorry, Coach, I didn't mean to cut you off.
mhm.
Sometimes this isn't the goal of this isn't necessarily for you to learn how to argue with someone.
Nope.
Instead, if you read something, research it, look it up before you start study, find out what's going on before you start repeating that
Mhm.
commentary.
Yep.
That's all I got.
All right. Very good. Okay. Well, that is all of that. So that deals with all of our our hard stuff, I think. Started with the hardest thing first, which would be formalizing the logic, getting into logical inference, and then our logical fallacies. So it kind of like got easier as we go. And then when we get into learning how to read a paper, it's going to be pretty straightforward. The way that it was taught to me how to do this, it's going to make a lot of sense, and people are going to, I think, gain a lot from it. So, and that will conclude our series, and hopefully we are going to have an audience who is much, much more confident in their ability to know things and to understand what they're reading in the future. So, all right. Hope some minds were blown today. Hope you guys get something from this, and we will see you next week. Lamby and Dwayne out.
Thank you, guys.